The morning sun rose over Tokyo, but it brought no warmth to the broken city. Smoke still drifted from buildings that had burned weeks ago. The streets were filled with rubble, twisted metal, and the shells of what used to be homes. September 1945 had arrived, and with it came the American soldiers who now walked through the ruins of Japan's capital. Private James Mitchell stepped off the military truck and stared at the destruction around him. He was 22 years old, tall and thin, with sandy brown hair and tired blue eyes. Back in Iowa, his family had a farm with green fields and a red barn. Here, everything was gray and black. The firebombing raids had turned 60% of Tokyo into ash and rubble. James had seen war before. He had fought in the Pacific Islands, seen his friends die, and learned to hate the enemy. But this was different. The war was over now. Japan had surrendered on August 15th after 2 atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Emperor Hirohito had spoken on the radio for the first time in history, telling his people that the war was lost. Now James and thousands of other American soldiers were here as occupation forces, not invaders. Sergeant Harris, a tough man from Texas with a thick mustache, gathered the unit together. His voice was rough and commanding. He told them the rules were simple. Stay alert. Keep distance from the locals. Do not trust anyone. The Japanese were defeated, but they were still the enemy who had attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941. That surprise attack had killed more than 2,000 Americans and started this whole bloody war. James nodded along with the others, but his mind was elsewhere. As they walked to their camp, he saw people in the streets. Thin people, starving people, old men who could barely walk, women with hollow cheeks and empty eyes, and children. So many children. The children looked like ghosts. Their clothes were torn and dirty. Their faces were covered in dust. Some had burns on their skin from the fires. They moved slowly, searching through piles of garbage for anything they could eat. James saw a boy who looked about 8 years old fighting with a stray dog over a rotten piece of fish, his stomach twisted. James knew hunger. During the Great Depression in the 1930s, his family had struggled too. He remembered being 7 years old, watching his mother cry because there was not enough food for dinner. His little sister had gone to bed hungry many nights. But this was worse. Much worse. The camp was set up near what used to be a park. Now, it was just flat ground surrounded by destroyed buildings. The soldiers put up their tents and organized supplies. They had plenty of food: canned meat, crackers, chocolate bars, and coffee. The military made sure American soldiers were well fed. That afternoon, James was assigned to guard duty at the edge of the camp. He stood there with his rifle, watching the street. A small figure caught his attention. It was a girl, maybe 6 years old. She had short black hair and wore a torn blue dress that was too big for her tiny body. She was walking slowly, looking at the ground, picking up small things and putting them in her pocket. The girl came closer to the camp fence. She stopped and stared at James. Her face was so thin that her cheekbones stuck out. Her eyes were huge and dark. She did not look afraid exactly. She looked too tired to be afraid. She just stood there, swaying slightly, like she might fall down any second. James remembered his sister again. He remembered holding her hand when they walked to school. He remembered her laugh. The little girl took one more step forward, then her legs gave out. She collapsed onto the dirt road. James moved without thinking. He ran to her, dropping to his knees beside her small body. She was still breathing, but barely conscious. He could feel every bone in her arms when he picked her up. She weighed almost nothing. Sergeant Harris was there in seconds, yelling at James to put the girl down and get back to his post. But another soldier, Private Danny Rodriguez, ran over with a canteen of water. Danny was from California, with dark hair and kind eyes. He helped James give the girl small sips of water. The girl opened her eyes. She looked terrified when she saw the American uniforms. She tried to pull away, making small, frightened sounds. In Japan, people had been told that American soldiers were monsters who would kill everyone. The government had encouraged civilians to fight to the death rather than surrender. Some families had killed themselves when the Americans arrived, believing terrible things would happen to them. James spoke softly, even though she could not understand English. He kept his voice gentle and calm. Slowly, the girl stopped struggling. She drank more water. Her eyes stayed locked on his face, watching for any sign of danger. Danny ran to get some crackers from his ration pack. When he came back, he broke them into small pieces and offered them to the girl. She hesitated for a long moment. Her hand reached out, then pulled back. Reached out again. Finally, she took a small piece and ate it so fast she almost choked. Sergeant Harris stood over them with his arms crossed. He was angry, but he did not order them to stop. He had children back home too. 3 daughters. James could see the war happening inside the sergeant's mind. The war between duty and humanity. Between following orders and doing what felt right. The girl ate 3 crackers, then suddenly pushed away and ran. She disappeared into the ruins before anyone could stop her. James watched her go, his heart heavy. Danny stood next to him and said quietly that they had to do something. They could not just watch children starve. That night, James lay in his tent, unable to sleep. Outside, the city was dark and silent. Somewhere out there, that little girl was trying to survive another night. Tomorrow she would search for food again. Tomorrow she might collapse again. And the next day, and the next, James made a decision. Orders were important. Discipline was important. But some things were more important than orders. Some lines could not be crossed without losing what made a person human. He would find that girl again. And when he did, he would help her. Whatever it took. The supply depot was busy with soldiers loading and unloading boxes. It was early morning, and the air was cool. James and Danny had been assigned to inventory duty, counting cans of food and making lists. It was boring work, but it kept them away from Sergeant Harris, who was still angry about the incident with the girl. The depot was located in what used to be a warehouse near the docks. Before the war, this area had been full of life and commerce. Japanese merchant ships had loaded and unloaded goods from all over Asia. Now the docks were destroyed, and the warehouse was barely standing. Half the roof was gone, and one wall had collapsed completely. James carried a box of rations to the storage area. Each box contained enough food to feed a soldier for a week. There were crackers, canned beef, chocolate bars, coffee, and cigarettes. The American military had spent billions of dollars making sure its soldiers never went hungry during the war. Meanwhile, Japanese civilians were eating grass and tree bark to survive. It had been a week since James saw the little girl collapse. He had looked for her every day during his patrols, but the city was huge and full of desperate people. More than 3 million civilians lived in Tokyo, and most of them were starving. The Japanese government had no food to give them. The war had destroyed everything. Danny was checking a list of supplies when he suddenly stopped and pointed. 3 children had appeared at the edge of the depot. They stood near a pile of rubble, half hidden, watching the soldiers. 2 boys and a girl. James felt his heart jump. It was her, the same little girl in the blue dress. The girl stood between 2 boys. One looked about 8 years old with messy black hair and a serious face. The other was maybe 7, shorter and rounder, though still painfully thin. All 3 children stared at the boxes of food with desperate, hungry eyes. But they did not come closer. They just stood there, frozen, like wild animals that wanted to approach but were too afraid. James remembered reading about the Battle of Okinawa that had ended just 4 months ago in June 1945. That battle had been one of the bloodiest in the Pacific War. More than 12,000 Americans died, but over 100,000 Japanese civilians also died. Many had been caught in the crossfire. Others had jumped off cliffs because they believed the propaganda that Americans would torture them. The Japanese military had told civilians that surrender meant worse than death. These children had grown up hearing those lies. They had been taught that Americans were demons. Now they were so hungry that they were willing to risk approaching those same demons for food. James set down his box and slowly walked toward the children. Danny followed him. The 3 kids immediately tensed up, ready to run. James stopped about 10 feet away and knelt down to seem less threatening. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a chocolate bar. It was part of his daily ration, something he had been saving. He held it out toward the children and smiled. He kept his movements slow and gentle. The children stared at the chocolate like it was a miracle. In Japan, chocolate had become impossible to find during the war. Sugar was rationed strictly, and most of it went to the military. The older boy said something in Japanese to the little girl. She shook her head and hid behind him. The younger boy took a small step forward, then stopped. James placed the chocolate bar on the ground and stepped back. He gestured for them to take it. For a long minute, nobody moved. Then the older boy made a decision. He walked forward slowly, watching James the entire time, ready to run if the American made any sudden move. When he reached the chocolate bar, he grabbed it quickly and jumped back. He did not run away, though. Instead, he carefully broke the chocolate into 3 pieces and gave one to each of his companions. The little girl took her piece with both hands. She looked at it like it was made of gold. Then she looked up at James, and for the first time, he saw something other than fear in her eyes. Confusion, maybe. Surprise. She could not understand why an American soldier would give her food. The 3 children ate their chocolate slowly, making it last as long as possible. They closed their eyes while they chewed, savoring every tiny bite. When they finished, the older boy did something unexpected. He bowed deeply. The other 2 children quickly did the same. Danny had been standing quietly behind James. Now he pulled out his own rations. He had crackers and a can of peaches. He opened the can with his knife and offered it to the children. This time they did not hesitate as long. The younger boy came forward and took the can. He drank some of the sweet syrup, then passed it to the others. They shared it equally, taking turns. Other soldiers had noticed what was happening. Corporal Peterson, an angry man from Georgia, walked over with his arms crossed. He was about 30 years old with a square jaw and cold eyes. His younger brother had been killed at Iwo Jima in March 1945 during one of the war's most brutal battles. 27,000 American casualties in just over a month of fighting. Peterson hated the Japanese with every fiber of his being. He stood there glaring at James and Danny. He told them they were fools. These were enemy children. Japanese children who would grow up to hate America just like their parents did. He said that giving them food was against regulations and disrespectful to all the Americans who had died fighting Japan. James stood up and faced Peterson. He kept his voice calm but firm. He said these were not enemy soldiers. They were just hungry kids. The war was over. Someone had to be the first to show mercy, or the hatred would never end. Peterson's face turned red. He looked like he wanted to punch James. But Danny stepped between them and reminded Peterson that General Douglas MacArthur himself, the supreme commander of the Allied forces in Japan, had said that the occupation should help rebuild Japan into a peaceful nation. That meant helping civilians, even if it was hard. Peterson swore at them and walked away. But several other soldiers had been watching and listening. One of them, a quiet man named Williams from Ohio, came over with a can of Spam. He gave it to the children without saying a word, then walked back to his work. The little girl looked at James one more time before leaving. She whispered something in Japanese. The older boy translated in broken English that he had learned from somewhere. He said, "Thank you." Then all 3 children bowed again and ran away, disappearing into the maze of rubble. Sergeant Harris had watched everything from near the warehouse. He shook his head slowly, but did not come over to yell. James knew the sergeant was fighting his own battle inside, between the soldier he was supposed to be and the father he was. That night, more soldiers started setting aside small portions of their rations. Word was spreading through the unit. Not everyone agreed with it, but enough did. Something was changing. 2 weeks had passed since the second meeting with the children. Every morning now, the 3 kids appeared near the camp. Sometimes they came alone. Sometimes other children followed them from a distance, too scared to approach but desperate enough to watch. The little girl in the blue dress, the older boy with the serious face, and the younger, rounder boy had become regular visitors. James learned their names through simple gestures and broken words. The girl was Yuki, which meant snow in Japanese. The older boy was her brother Kenji, which meant strong and healthy, though he was anything but healthy now. The younger boy was their friend Hiro, meaning generous. The 3 of them had survived the firebombing together, hiding in a canal while their neighborhood burned. The Great Tokyo Air Raid had happened on March 10, 1945. American B-29 bombers had dropped napalm bombs across the city for hours. The fires were so hot that the canals boiled. Over 100,000 people died in a single night, most of them civilians. It was one of the deadliest air raids in human history, even worse than the atomic bombs in some ways, because more people died. Yuki and Kenji's parents had pushed them into the canal before running back to save their grandmother. The children waited all night in the cold water while the city burned above them. Their parents never came back. When morning came, the two children climbed out to find their entire neighborhood gone. Just ashen bodies. They found Hiro wandering alone, crying for his mother. James learned all this slowly, over many days, through hand gestures and the few Japanese words he was learning. Kenji knew some English from school before the war. He taught James simple words. James taught them English in return. Yuki was shy and rarely spoke, but she had started to smile sometimes when James gave her candy. The soldiers who shared food with the children had grown from 3 to 12. Even some who had been angry at first started joining in. They would save portions of their meals, hiding crackers in their pockets or cans in their bags. When the children came each morning, there would be a small pile of food waiting for them near the fence point one morning. Yuki brought someone new, an old woman who moved slowly, leaning on a walking stick. She wore a faded kimono that had been beautiful once. Her hair was white and pulled back in a traditional style. Her face was covered in wrinkles, and her hands shook, but her eyes were sharp and intelligent. Kenji explained in his broken English that this was their grandmother. Not the one who died in the fire, but their father's mother who lived on the other side of the city. She had spent weeks searching for them through the ruins. When she finally found them living in a collapsed building, she brought them to her small shelter. But she was old and had no money and no food. She could not care for them alone. The grandmother stood before the American soldiers and bowed very deeply. Japanese culture placed enormous importance on respect and proper behavior. For her to bow so low to foreign soldiers, especially ones who had been enemies, showed desperate gratitude. Tears ran down her wrinkled cheeks. She spoke in Japanese, her voice cracking with emotion. Kenji translated haltingly. His grandmother was saying thank you for saving her grandchildren's lives. She was saying that she had been taught Americans were monsters, but monsters do not feed starving children. She was saying that maybe the war had taught everyone to be monsters, but perhaps peace could teach them to be human again. James felt a lump in his throat. Danny, standing next to him, wiped his eyes. Even some of the harder soldiers looked away, uncomfortable with their own emotions. Sergeant Harris watched from a distance, his face unreadable. James knelt down in front of the grandmother and spoke slowly. He told her that his own grandmother back in Iowa had taught him that children should never suffer for the mistakes of adults. He told her that the war was over, and now they had to build something better. He did not know if she understood his English, but she seemed to understand his meaning. She reached out with her shaking hand and touched his cheek gently, like he was her own grandson. That afternoon, James showed Kenji how to play catch with a baseball he had brought from America. The boy had never seen baseball before. In Japan, they played different games. But Kenji learned quickly, his serious face breaking into a real smile when he caught the ball for the first time. Yuki and Hiro watched and clapped. Soon other soldiers joined in, teaching the children how to throw and catch. For a brief moment, it felt like they were not in a destroyed city at all. Just people playing together, but not everyone was happy about the growing friendship. Corporal Peterson grew angrier each day. He would stand and watch the children with cold hatred in his eyes. Other soldiers shared his feelings. They remembered Pearl Harbor, the surprise attack that started the war. They remembered the Bataan Death March in the Philippines, where Japanese soldiers forced 70,000 American and Filipino prisoners to walk 65 miles with no food or water. 10,000 died on that march from exhaustion, disease, and random executions. Peterson finally confronted James directly one evening after dinner. He got in James's face and said that his brother had died fighting these people. His baby brother had been 19 years old when he was killed on Iwo Jima. The Japanese had fought from underground tunnels, refusing to surrender even when defeat was certain. 20,000 Japanese soldiers died defending that tiny island, and they took 7,000 Americans with them. Peterson demanded to know how James could look at Japanese children and not see the enemy. How could he forget what they did to America? How could he forgive? James listened quietly. When Peterson finished, James spoke in a low voice that everyone nearby could hear. He said he had not forgotten anything. He had been at Guadalcanal in 1942. He had seen his best friend die from a Japanese sniper bullet. He still had nightmares about it. But he also knew that Yuki was 6 years old. She had never held a gun. She had never attacked anyone. She was just a little girl who wanted to live. James said that if they wanted revenge, they could take it. They could let the children starve. They could turn their backs and feel justified. But that would not bring back Peterson's brother or James's friend or any of the hundreds of thousands who died. It would just create more hatred, more suffering, more death. Someone had to break the cycle. Someone had to choose differently. Peterson stared at him for a long moment. His fists were clenched, his jaw tight. Then he turned and walked away without another word. But James saw something in his eyes. Not agreement exactly, but maybe the first crack in the armor of hate. That night, the children did not come. Or the next morning. James worried that something had happened, that maybe the grandmother had been arrested for fraternizing with Americans. The Japanese government was in chaos, with different groups fighting for control. Some still wanted to resist the occupation. On the third day, Kenji appeared alone. He looked terrified. He explained in his broken English that their grandmother was very sick. She had a fever and could not wake up properly. They had no medicine and no doctor. The local hospital had been destroyed in the bombing. He was begging for help. James looked at Sergeant Harris. This was the moment of decision. Helping civilians was one thing. Leaving the camp to go into the city was something else entirely. It could be a trap. It could be dangerous. It was definitely against regulations. Sergeant Harris stared back at James. The whole unit seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The news spread through the camp like wildfire. The grandmother was sick, possibly dying, and Kenji had come begging for help. Soldiers gathered around to see what Sergeant Harris would decide. Some whispered that it was obviously a trap. Others argued that an old woman and 3 children were not a threat. The debate grew heated. Word had reached them just 2 days earlier that General Douglas MacArthur was establishing new policies for the occupation. Radio broadcasts from Tokyo reported that MacArthur wanted to win Japanese hearts and minds, not just control their land. He was talking about democracy, women's rights, and land reform. He wanted to transform Japan from a military dictatorship into a peaceful ally. But those were just words from far away. Here on the ground, soldiers still did not know who to trust. James stepped forward and volunteered to go. Danny immediately joined him. Williams, the quiet man from Ohio, surprised everyone by offering to come too. Sergeant Harris rubbed his weathered face with both hands. He looked 10 years older than he had when they arrived in Japan. Finally, he made his decision. He would allow 3 soldiers to go, but they had to take weapons and be back before dark. If they were not back by sunset, he would send a search party. The sergeant pulled James aside and spoke quietly. He said that an inspection was coming tomorrow. A full-bird colonel from MacArthur's headquarters would be visiting camps throughout Tokyo to evaluate the occupation efforts. If the colonel found out that soldiers were leaving camp to help Japanese civilians, there could be serious consequences. Court-martial was possible, but Harris said he would handle it. He just told James to be careful and come back alive. James, Danny, and Williams followed Kenji through the ruined streets. The boy moved quickly despite his thin frame, leading them through a maze of collapsed buildings and debris. The destruction was worse than James had realized from inside the camp. Entire neighborhoods had been erased. In some places, you could see for blocks because there were no buildings left standing, just rubble and the occasional wall. They passed other civilians who stared at the American soldiers with fear and suspicion. Some hurried away. Others just watched silently. An old man spit on the ground as they walked by. A young woman held her baby closer and turned her back. The hatred was still there, simmering under the surface of defeat. After 20 minutes of walking, they reached what used to be a residential area. Now, it was a collection of makeshift shelters built from scrap metal, wood, and cloth. Hundreds of people lived here in the ruins, trying to survive. Children with hollow eyes watched them pass. Women stirred pots of thin soup over small fires. Men sat with blank expressions, staring at nothing. Kenji led them to a shelter that was slightly better than the others. It had 4 walls made from salvaged materials and a roof of corrugated metal. Inside, it was dark and cramped. The grandmother lay on a thin mat on the floor. Yuki knelt beside her, holding her hand and crying quietly. Hiro sat in the corner, looking scared. James knelt next to the old woman and felt her forehead. She was burning with fever. Her breathing was shallow and rapid. Her eyes were closed, and she mumbled in Japanese, lost in fever dreams. Without medicine, she would probably die within days, maybe hours. Williams had brought a medical kit. He was not a trained medic, but he had basic first aid knowledge. He gave the grandmother aspirin to reduce the fever and cleaned a wound on her arm that had become infected. That was likely the source of the infection. In normal times, it would have been a minor injury. But with no clean water, no medicine, and malnutrition weakening her body, even small wounds could kill. Danny used his canteen to give her water mixed with some salt and sugar. Dehydration was as dangerous as the infection. They made the grandmother as comfortable as possible, propping up her head and covering her with a blanket from William's pack. Then they waited. The 3 soldiers stayed for an hour, monitoring the grandmother's condition and talking quietly with the children. Kenji explained that many people in the shelter were angry about them being there. Some had lost family to American bombs. Some had sons who died fighting American soldiers. But they were too weak and too defeated to do anything about it. James looked around the shelter and saw a photograph on the wall. It showed a man in a Japanese military uniform standing proudly. Next to him was a younger version of the grandmother and 2 small boys. Kenji saw where James was looking and explained quietly. That was their father and uncle. Both had died in the war. Father at Guadalcanal, uncle at Midway. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 had been a turning point in the Pacific War. Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers and many of its best pilots in one battle. It was the beginning of Japan's decline. Guadalcanal, where James had fought, was a brutal 6-month campaign that claimed 30,000 Japanese lives. Now James sat in the home of a family destroyed by those same battles. The irony was crushing. James might have been shooting at Kenji's father. Kenji's uncle might have bombed American ships where Danny's cousins served. The war had tangled all their lives together in blood and death. And now here they were, enemies trying to become something else. As the sun began to set, the grandmother's fever broke slightly. She opened her eyes and saw the American soldiers in her shelter. Confusion crossed her face, then understanding. She whispered something to Kenji, who translated. She was thanking them and apologizing for being trouble. James told her through Kenji that she was no trouble, that taking care of sick people was what humans did, that the war was over and they had to start over as friends. They gave Kenji all the medicine they had brought and promised to bring more tomorrow. Williams showed him how to keep the wound clean. Danny left half his rations for the children. Then the 3 soldiers prepared to head back to camp. Before full darkness fell, as they were leaving, something unexpected happened. Corporal Peterson appeared at the entrance of a shelter. He was alone, breathing hard like he had been running. Everyone froze. Peterson had followed them somehow, against orders, and now he stood there with an expression that James could not read. Peterson walked past the soldiers without looking at them. He went straight to where the children sat with their grandmother. From his pack, he pulled out a full medical kit, much better than what Williams had brought. He also had antibiotics, real medicine that could save the grandmother's life. He set them down carefully. Then Peterson did something that shocked everyone. He knelt down in front of Yuki and pulled a photograph from his pocket. It showed a young soldier smiling at the camera. Peterson's hands shook as he held it. He spoke in a choked voice, saying this was his brother. Saying his brother was 19 when he died. Saying he looked at Yuki and Kenji and Hiro and finally understood that Japanese families had lost 19-year-olds too. Tears ran down Peterson's hard face. He said he did not know if he could forgive yet, but maybe he could stop hating. Maybe that was a start. The grandmother, weak and feverish, reached out and touched Peterson's hand. She said something in Japanese that Kenji translated. She said her sons died with honor, as did his brother, and now the living must honor them by choosing peace. Peterson broke down completely. sobbing like a child. Yuki, the little girl who had been terrified of Americans just weeks ago, walked over and hugged him. She did not speak English, and he did not speak Japanese, but some things needed no translation. The four soldiers walked back to camp in darkness, breaking curfew and risking punishment. But none of them cared. Something profound had shifted. When they arrived, Sergeant Harris was waiting with a worried expression. Behind him stood a tall officer in a crisp uniform. The colonel had arrived early for his inspection, and he had questions about where four soldiers had been. Colonel Robert Armstrong stood 6 feet tall, with silver hair and a chest full of medals earned from 3 years of Pacific combat. He had landed on D-Day in Normandy in June 1944, then transferred to the Pacific Theater in time for the final push toward Japan. His uniform was immaculate, his posture rigid, and his expression unreadable as he watched the four soldiers return to camp after curfew. Sergeant Harris stood at attention, his face tight with worry. The entire unit had gathered, sensing that something important was about to happen. James, Danny, Williams, and Peterson lined up, waiting for punishment. They had broken regulations, left camp without proper authorization, and returned late. Any of those offenses could result in court-martial. Colonel Armstrong walked slowly in front of them, his boots crunching on the gravel. He stopped in front of James and asked where they had been. James considered lying, but decided against it. He explained everything: the starving children, the sick grandmother, the medicine they delivered, the risk they took to help former enemies. The colonel listened without interrupting. When James finished, Armstrong turned to Sergeant Harris and asked if the sergeant had authorized this mission. Harris stood straight and said yes, he had. It was a lie, and everyone knew it. Harris was protecting his men, willing to take the full blame himself. Armstrong was quiet for a long moment. Then he surprised everyone. He told them to stand at ease. He said that 2 days ago, he had received direct orders from General MacArthur's headquarters. The occupation strategy was changing. Instead of treating Japan as conquered territory to be controlled through force, they were going to rebuild it as a democratic ally. That meant winning trust. That meant showing humanity. The colonel explained that MacArthur had been studying the occupation of Germany after World War I. That occupation had been harsh and punishing, creating resentment that helped Hitler rise to power. MacArthur was determined not to repeat that mistake. He wanted American soldiers to be seen as liberators and helpers, not oppressors. The general had even started a program to send food aid to Japanese civilians, though it would take weeks to organize fully. Armstrong looked at the four soldiers with something like respect. He said they had done exactly what MacArthur wanted just before official orders arrived. Instead of punishment, they would be commended. Their actions would become a model for other units. Starting immediately, organized humanitarian efforts would begin across occupied Japan. The relief in the camp was palpable. Soldiers who had been tense relaxed. Sergeant Harris actually smiled, something James had rarely seen. But Colonel Armstrong was not finished speaking. He said there would be a Christmas celebration in 6 weeks, in December 1945. He wanted this unit to organize a special event that brought together soldiers and local civilians, especially children. It would be filmed and photographed to show people back in America that peace was possible. Over the following weeks, the camp transformed. What had been a secretive operation of soldiers sharing food became an official relief program. A medical tent was set up where civilians could receive treatment. Food distribution was organized. Japanese civilians who spoke English were hired to help translate and coordinate efforts. The grandmother recovered from her infection and became one of the key helpers, respected by both Americans and Japanese. More civilians began coming to the camp, cautiously at first, then with growing trust. The soldiers learned Japanese words. The civilians learned English. Children who had hidden in the ruins started playing in the open. Yuki, Kenji, and Hiro became leaders among the children, teaching others that the Americans were safe. The soldiers helped rebuild a small schoolhouse that had been partially destroyed. They carried rubble, fixed walls, and replaced windows. Japanese men who had been soldiers weeks earlier worked alongside American soldiers who had fought against them. It was awkward and strange, but it was happening. Former enemies were becoming something new, Corporal Peterson changed the most. He spent hours playing with the children, teaching them games and making them laugh. He still carried his brother's photograph, but now he could look at it without only feeling rage. He told James one night that he would never stop missing his brother, but he had learned that honoring the dead meant building something better for the living. December arrived with cold wind and occasional snow. Christmas was coming, and preparations intensified. The soldiers pooled their resources to gather gifts for the children. Candy, toys sent from America, warm clothes, and blankets. Japanese civilians contributed what they could: origami decorations, traditional sweets made from ration ingredients, and handmade gifts. That on December 23rd, the celebration took place in the rebuilt schoolhouse. Over 100 people gathered: American soldiers, Japanese civilians, elderly people, and dozens of children. Tables were set up with food, more food than most Japanese had seen in years. There was music from both cultures. Soldiers sang Silent Night, while Japanese civilians performed traditional songs. Kenji, who had become more confident, sang a Japanese folk song in a clear, strong voice. The room fell silent listening to him. When he finished, everyone applauded. Then Yuki, still shy but braver than before, presented James with a gift she had made. It was an origami crane folded from paper she had found. In Japanese tradition, the crane symbolized peace and hope. She had made it carefully, and it was perfect. James accepted it with tears in his eyes. He knelt down, so he was eye level with her, and said "thank you" in Japanese, one of the phrases he had learned. Yuki smiled, a real genuine smile that lit up her whole face. She was not the starving, terrified girl who had collapsed in the street anymore. She was a child who had hope again. The celebration continued with soldiers and civilians sharing food and conversation. Children played games together, language barriers falling away in the universal language of play. Old prejudices did not disappear completely. They lingered in glances and hesitations, but they were cracking piece by piece. Colonel Armstrong walked through the room with a photographer, documenting everything. These images would go back to America, showing a side of the occupation that many had not imagined possible. They would help change how Americans thought about their former enemies. As the evening ended, Sergeant Harris stood with James looking at the celebration. Harris said that when he first arrived in Japan, he thought his job was to maintain order and control. He thought the Japanese would always hate Americans for defeating them. But he had been wrong. His job was to help build peace, and peace was harder than war, but infinitely more important. James received orders in early January that his unit would ship home by the end of the month. The war was truly over for him, but saying goodbye would be the hardest thing he had done. On his last day in Tokyo, Yuki, Kenji, and Hiro came to see him one final time. They brought small gifts and cards they had made. They cried, and so did James. Kenji, whose English had improved greatly, told James that he wanted to study in America someday, that he wanted to build bridges between the two countries. Yuki gave James another origami crane to remember her by. Hiro, usually cheerful, was silent with tears running down his face. James promised to write to them. He promised to remember. He promised that what started here would not end, that the friendship between enemies turned friends would grow into something lasting. His ship left Tokyo Harbor. James stood on the deck watching the city shrink in the distance. He thought about everything that had happened, about choosing compassion over hatred, about taking risks for strangers, about how yesterday's enemies had become today's friends. He thought about how one chocolate bar shared with a starving child had started a transformation that spread to hundreds of people. The ship sailed toward America, toward home, toward a future none of them could fully predict. But James knew one thing with certainty. The seeds planted in those months in Tokyo would grow. The children who received food and kindness would grow up to rebuild Japan into something new. They would remember the Americans who chose mercy. And maybe, just maybe, they would teach their own children that even after the worst hatred, peace was possible. In his pocket, James carried 2 origami cranes and a photograph of 3 smiling children. Reminders that humanity could be found in the darkest places. That healing could begin with the smallest gesture. That the choice to be human Even when it was hard, even when it seemed impossible, was always the right choice.